podcast contains descriptions of death and violence that some listeners may find upsetting.
Hello and welcome to the 6 o'clock knock, the true crime podcast that takes a fresh look at murder. I'm Simon Ford, a journalist and broadcaster with 20-odd years in the business.
And I'm Jack Morrell, 30 years a British police officer and detective.
I spent many an hour on the press benches of various courts, reporting on the kind of crimes that Jack spent his career detecting. Now, the English legal system has influenced many others around the world. Our system of common law, or case law, originated in the practices of the courts of the English kings following the Norman conquest in 1066.
And to be clear, Scotland wasn't conquered by the Normans, which is why the Scottish legal system is different from the one in England and Wales.
Absolutely, and comparisons, as the saying goes, are odious. Now, the British Empire imposed that English legal system on its far-flung colonies, many of which retain the common law system today. These systems give great weight to judicial precedent. Today, of course, there's no British Empire, but 1/3 of the world's population lives in common law jurisdictions, including Jamaica and that other former colony, the United States of America.
Jamaica declared its independence from Britain in 1962, but remained a member of the Commonwealth. And it's to Jamaica that we are heading today. Then we'll look at a second case, also from over the Atlantic. Both cases are very different, but both involve the murder of prominent musical artists, and both involved firearms. Our main focus is that of the murder of Winston Hubert McIntosh, better known as Peter Tosh, Jamaican reggae artist.
Peter Tosh was the baritone who left Bob Marley and the Wailers, went solo and worked with the Rolling Stones, among others. The one who learnt how to ride a unicycle and rode onto the stage on it.
That's him. His other claim to fame, he was shot and killed in 1987. We'll compare his murder to the fatal shooting of John Winston Lennon, British musician, founder member of the Beatles, shot and killed 7 years earlier in 1980.
I suppose everyone remembers where they were when a celebrity gets murdered. I'll be honest though, Peter Tosh was less well known in our household. But John Lennon, now his murder took place on the evening of Monday the 8th of December 1980 in New York, 5 hours behind London time, so I woke up to the news on Tuesday the 9th. Now, my dad had bought a colour TV in time for Christmas, and John Lennon's murder was one of the first stories I saw in colour on the TV news.
John Lennon is dead, shot several times by a young American as he was going into his home in New York. The former Beatle, who was 40, was returning home from a recording studio with his wife, Yoko Ono, when he was murdered.
It took a few days for the enormity of what had happened to sink in, the significance of the talent that had been lost. But there was a school assembly, I remember, where John Lennon's music was played in tribute, and even some of the teachers were moved to tears. It was one of those moments that made me want to record significant events, and, I guess, set me on the path to becoming a journalist. Now, I know very little about Peter Tosh, but you're a fan, aren't you, Jack? Tell me something about the man and his music.
Well, from what I know, his childhood was one of survival. He was abandoned by his parents and moved around between relatives. Now, this was rural Jamaica, and when his aunt died, he moved to Trenchtown in Kingston, aged about 15. His introduction to music was amazing, though. He used to sit and watch a man playing guitar in the street. Now, this man only played the one tune, but Tosh was mesmerised. After seeing him many times, Tosh picked up the guitar and played the song back to the man. The man asked him who taught him to play guitar, and Tosh replied, "You have." He'd learnt by watching. Tosh then learnt some singing skills from a guy who gave free music lessons to young people. And it was there he met Bob Marley and Bunny Wailer, who were doing the same thing. And as they say, the rest is history.
That's fascinating. And do you recall where you were when the news of these deaths was reported?
Yes and no. I was working full-time in 1987, and while I have some Peter Tosh records at home, I don't remember where I was when news of his death broke. I guess as a young cop working shifts, I was just too busy to follow the news. I can remember clearly when the news of Lennon's death happened. The difference is that I was 17 years old in 1980, and there's something about teenage memories that seems stronger, isn't there?
That's very true. Yeah, I'd agree with that. My memory of the first colour TV and the teachers in tears, that kind of thing, it's just frozen there somehow, that moment crystallised.
And when I think about it, it's as though I'm back in my tiny box of a bedroom. It's just big enough for a single bed, wardrobe, a chair and a bedside cabinet. I had a radio alarm clock. I can picture it now. It had an illuminated red digital display, classic 70s. I was listening to the morning show on Radio 1. The DJ, I think, was Mike Reed, and I could hear something different in his voice. He was emotional and struggling for words. I knew then how much of a big deal it was, as the whole show was a news item with a few John Lennon songs.
For those people who do not know and may have just joined us, John Lennon died earlier today as the result of what seems to be one of those idiotic and pointless attacks by someone who probably didn't even know him. He was shot dead in New York at about 4 o'clock GMT.
Yes, I remember now. We had the BBC News on in the kitchen and John Lennon was shot 4 times in the back. His killer, Mark David Chapman, waited for the police to arrive and immediately admitted what he'd done.
Well, Peter Tosh was killed on the 11th of September 1987. He was shot during a robbery at his home in Kingston, Jamaica. His killers, though, didn't hang around for the police to arrive. They were arrested later. One man was convicted of the crime, Dennis Lobban, although he still maintains his innocence.
Now, these murders were 7 years apart and happened in very different circumstances, the only connection being both were musicians and both were shot in cold blood.
And both men shared the same forename of Winston, don't forget.
Yes, that's an interesting coincidence, isn't it? I wonder if it's significant. The motive for their killings is very different. While their respective killers are still in jail, what would have happened to them if their victims had not been famous artists?
Almost certainly released, I guess. What we also want to do is to expand on the detail and then consider whether there's a similarity in the mindset of the killers of both Peter Tosh and John Lennon.
I guess it's hard for us in the UK to appreciate the place that guns have in society in both the USA and Jamaica, but the fact remains that nearly 40 years after the murders of John Lennon and Peter Tosh, firearms are disproportionately used in killings in both countries. The United States' relationship with guns and gun control is well documented, and according to a survey in 2017, Jamaica is one of the most armed countries per head of population in the world.
It seems so alien to us in the UK. We have some of the strictest firearms controls in the world, although to an extent, some of that gun culture has spread over here.
Jamaican law allows firearm ownership on what's called a may-issue basis. Their gun laws were tightened up in the early 1970s due to a rise in criminal gangs and political violence. The People's National Party was led by Michael Manley, a socialist who was branded a communist. The Jamaica Labour Party was led by Edward Seager and was the right-wing party. Polarised politics again.
And, of course, Bob Marley was also shot during this period, but survived.
Yes, he, some would say naively, offered to perform a free concert for Prime Minister Manley. Then an election was called, and Marley was branded a Manley supporter.
That's very true. It was like a civil war in the 1970s. Downtown Kingston was divided on sectarian lines, a bit like Northern Ireland. The thing is that the gun culture had become ingrained in the dancehall culture too.
As a former British police officer, did you experience that Jamaican gun culture?
Yes, to an extent. Early in my career, I remember dealing with a domestic incident. We'd managed to detain the man after a struggle, and he was from Jamaica, and while we were driving to the police station, he said that if we were back in Jamaica, he'd have shot me. I think I replied with something like, well, that's a bit extreme.
And was that a common experience?
Oh, yes. I mean, don't forget, police officers have to deal with people under stress and in high emotion, and the arrest makes situations worse. Verbal threats towards the police are common. Most threats are along the lines of, I'll bat you if I see you off duty. And that's why the threat of being shot was a bit extreme.
And what about the dancehall culture you mentioned? There's an article from The Guardian in 2001 that says, Jamaican dancehall music is endlessly preoccupied with the gun. Many DJs have a device on their mixer that mimics the sound of a gunshot. Even in the sleepiest village, a dance event can sound from a distance like a gun battle. Guns occupy such a central role in Jamaican culture that it's common to see posters outside that say things like, "Leave your machine and bring your queen."
Right. I remember a few years ago, there was a community centre that hosted a regular dance for the Jamaican community. It had been closed temporarily after an incident, and we had to search and photograph the main dance hall. We found bullet holes and bullets in the ceiling. There had been no reports about this. From what we were told, they'd been there for some time, and the weapons had presumably been discharged quite casually. It was nothing more than to give the occasion an authentic Jamaican dance hall feel.
Yeah, quite. And that Guardian newspaper article continues. Recent violence has seen 23 people shot dead, bearing in mind this is 2001. But a former Jamaican resident says guns are an integral part of island life. Now, in the interests of fairness, I'm bound to say this report is 19 years old. And, boy, a lot can happen in 19 years. Plus, I've never been to Jamaica. Neither Jack nor I are from a West Indian community, and if I know anything about human nature, which I think I do, it will be a minority of Jamaicans who get their country a reputation for violence. Just like so many other parts of the world, for which you can partly blame the media. Blame me. And if you'd like your say on the matter, please do contact us on Twitter, where we are @6knock.
Wise words indeed. Now, let's look at one of the consequences of a firearm being discharged. The death of Peter Tosh.
How did the internationally known artist Peter Tosh, second only in fame to the legendary Bob Marley, come to be killed? An article in the Jamaican Observer helps to explain. The journalist is Sybil Hibbert. Sybil was not only a court reporter, she was also the wife of the officer in charge of the investigation, Detective Superintendent Isidore Hibbert.
A marriage between a court reporter and a senior police officer? Now that would make for some interesting dinner party conversations.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. And there's even a dodgy cop involved in the actual case too. To add extra spice to the whole movie-like scenario, there were several witnesses to the killing. Peter Tosh and his partner Marlene Brown were entertaining a number of guests at their home in Kingston. There was his friend Jeff Free-Eye Dixon and his wife, Joy, along with other friends and musicians, Wilton Doc Brown, Michael Robinson and Santa Davis.
Peter Tosh had been part of the Wailers from 1963 to 1977. They were a trio. The others were Bunny Livingston and, of course, Bob Marley. Tosh was known for his biting lyrics and radical disposition that endeared him to those who opposed the establishment. He even carried a guitar in the shape of an M16 rifle, and it was ironic, or maybe inevitable, that a firearm would bring about his death.
The only person ever convicted of the murders was a 33-year-old man by the name of Dennis Lobban, known also as Lepo. The court heard that Peter Tosh had been friends with Lepo for years, since their days in Trenchtown, the poor area of Kingston where many rural Jamaicans settled when they came to find work. The district was full of cheaply built dwellings clustered round central courtyards with communal kitchens and lavatories. The court heard how Tosh had supported and helped Lepo. Tosh even let him stay at his house after a spell in prison.
Tosh may have moved on from Trenchtown, but he continued to live his Rastafarian lifestyle, looking after others less fortunate. But he was now living 6 miles away from Trenchtown in an affluent neighbourhood. His house looked down over Kingston from the hillside that rises up to the scenic Blue Mountains. Its spacious, airy rooms opened onto balconies through large patio doors.
Lepo had visited Plymouth Avenue several times and was familiar with the dogs that guarded the house. The word on the street was that Lepo had taken the rap for Tosh, done time for him, and felt betrayed by his celebrity buddy. But that wasn't the evidence that came out in court. It was Marlene Brown's testimony that was crucial. She said that she and Tosh were at home with friends, enjoying what she called a private, peaceful evening, watching a programme by satellite in their living room. Amid drinks and subdued laughter, the peace was shattered by the unexpected entry of Leppo, accompanied by 2 unidentified gunmen. The partygoers were ordered to belly it, meaning lie face down. Leppo also demanded US currency.
Peter Tosh had not long come back from a business trip to the United States, where he was expected to be paid in US dollars. Apparently, Leppo had overheard telephone conversations about this business trip. It appeared that he had planned the robbery to coincide with his return. Tosh told him he had no money. Marlene Brown also claimed that Leppo had also accused her of coming between him and Tosh, saying she had broken up their friendship. But there was another crucial witness, the man called Michael Robinson. His account starts with the arrival of Leppo and his henchmen at Peter Tosh's mansion. There was a knock at the door. Marlene Brown asked Robinson to answer it. Everyone expected it to be their friend named Free Eye and his wife, but it wasn't. Michael's words are spoken by an actor.
I saw that it was not Free Eye, but it was somebody who visit the yard regularly, named Leppo. He being a regular visitor. I backed off the dogs and told him and his friends to come in, which they did. As I entered this reception area, 2 of them pulled guns and said, "We Peter." March upstairs, entered the living room, everyone face down.
Michael Robinson's account was just as Marlene Brown had said. But what was the motive for these men asking to speak to Peter Tosh? Michael Robinson continued.
I was lying on the ground, still constantly asking for the money, US dollars. Peter said they could search the house and take anything they want. We argued with the man, opened fire. They fired single shot first that caught Marlene in the head. They fired 2 more shots at Peter in the head, then opened a barrage of shots.
After the adrenaline kicked in and when the first person opened fire, did they panic? Having found several people in the house, were the gunmen nervous about being challenged?
Well, before the guns were discharged, Leppo instructed his accomplices to disarm Tosh, as he was known to be a black belt in martial arts. Tosh was frisked and struck over the head with a pistol. When Marlene objected to some of the remarks made by Leppo, witnesses testified that Leppo threatened to kill Tosh, who was sprawled helpless on the floor. It was then that the DJ named Free Eye, real name Jeff Dixon, and his wife arrived. They walked right into the stick-up. They're bundled inside and ordered to lie face down on the floor. When Free Eye objected, he got the muzzle of a gun jabbed into his side, after which he did exactly as he was told. Leppo and his crew stripped the party guests of their jewellery and other personal effects.
When the shooting stopped, Tosh, Free Eye and a third man, Wilton Brown, were dead. Marlene Brown, who'd been shot first, was still conscious and lying in the dark corner of the room, petrified. With a bullet lodged in the back of her skull, she somehow managed to stay still.
Marlene was asked whether the incident was a robbery that had gone wrong. In her statement, she was very clear on her view.
Them use that as an excuse. Me not care. Me no say them was sent. Was ordered to come tonight. Peter, you're dead tonight. Me come for kill you. Them words there, me never forget.
So it seems the prime motive was to murder Tosh. And if they got away with a few wallets and Rolexes, well, that was payment. Marlene Brown and Michael Robinson both told the police they heard their attackers roar away on motorbikes. However, the senior investigating officer told the jury that Leppo was arrested thanks to the confession of a getaway car driver, Steve Russell, a local cabbie. He claimed to have heard a volley of shots before driving the 3 men away from the Tosh residence.
Now this is where the investigation got a bit messy. How reliable was this confession? Well, it wasn't helped by the fact that the driver claimed to have sought advice from a police officer who, surprise, surprise, denied any such conversation. And it contradicted Brown and Robinson's testimony about the killers being on motorbikes.
Yes, and in the early days of the investigation, it was Russell, the taxi driver, who claimed that Leppo had asked him to take him and his crew to Peter Tosh's home. Russell said he was not aware of the purpose of the visit. He picked them up from the Carib Theatre at Crossroads, a suburb of Kingston. Russell was told to wait while Leppo and the others went to the house. Some time later, Russell heard several gunshots. Then Leppo and the other 2 men came running back to the taxi, each with gun in hand. Leppo shouted to Russell, "Drive! Drive!" The next day, after hearing the news about the murders and not knowing what to do, Russell sought advice from a police officer he knew, Constable Austin. Russell claimed that PC Austin told him to keep quiet, and for that reason Russell didn't go to the police station to report the matter. Unsurprisingly, Constable Austin denied that this conversation had ever taken place. Later, a Roman Catholic priest took Leppo to CID headquarters, where he was interviewed. Leppo refused to name the others. Both Leppo and Russell were charged jointly with the murders of Peter Tosh, Free Eye and Wilton Brown.
In the course of the trial, Leppo's defence team objected to the use of Russell's confession. They argued that the confession was false and that it had a prejudicial effect that outweighed its probative value. In simple terms, though, Russell's account added to the stack of witnesses who named Leppo and fingered him as the ringleader.
Russell was acquitted and walked free from court. Leppo Lobben's defence was an alibi. He also took the unusual step of giving evidence on oath from the witness box. He claimed that Marlene Brown and Michael Robinson were both motivated by malice, that Marlene Brown had called him a fucking liar and a news carrier to Tosh. In spite of all that, he also accepted in court that he regularly ate food that she cooked for him.
He wanted to have his cake and eat it.
Leppo had a go at Michael Robinson too. He claimed that Robinson was jealous of his close friendship with Tosh. He recalled a time when Robinson asked Tosh for money. Tosh gave Robinson less than he gave to Leppo because Leppo was his brother. Leppo claimed that Robinson shunned and ignored and generally disrespected him too.
What I'm hearing here is that there was a lot of jealousy in these friendships. I've seen it in poorer communities. They tend to be more insular, and people who have made money are always under pressure from their associates. Money corrupts if it's not handled carefully. We also saw it in the way Bob Marley lived his life. Their Rastafarian attitude was very free and easy. They had become wealthy and they lived a good life. But their open house attitude meant that there were many people who were vying for status and favours.
People were getting greedy, and jealous cracks were showing in these friendships.
Yeah, and this guy Leppo had a problem. He was a known criminal, drug user, and struggling to earn a living as a poet. Not only was he desperate for money, he was also jealous of others who were close to Tosh. He had an even bigger problem. 2 of the people who survived the robbery were naming him as the gunman.
His problems got worse. He was convicted on all counts. I think the jury took 6 minutes to return the verdict. Well, the case went to the appeal court twice, and both times it was kicked out. Dennis Leppo Lobben is still serving a term of life imprisonment behind the walls of the General Penitentiary, now the Tower Street Adult Correctional Centre in Kingston. Another prisoner during his time there was the dodgy cop who was mixed up with the Steve Russell evidence. Disgraced former police constable Leonard Austin was later convicted of murdering a security supervisor employed at Kingston Wharves Limited.
It's no wonder the Jamaican government introduced those drastic measures in the 1970s, jury-free courts for firearm murders. These witnesses and the jurors needed to be protected.
So, we've seen the evidence in the murder of Peter Tosh. Don't forget that Wilton, Doc Brown and Free Eye were also killed, and then there was the wounding of 4 others. Carlton Santa Davis, a drummer in Peter Tosh's band, Free Eye's wife Yvonne, and Michael Robinson. We've got an idea about the culture in Jamaica at the time.
And, whilst we accept the evidence of Marlene Brown and her opinion that they came to kill Peter Tosh that night, there is nothing really to say other than in the culture of Trenchtown, people were shot over petty squabbles and jealousies. He couldn't shake off the culture of blood and fire that surrounds reggae music.
Peter Tosh advocated smoking marijuana. He recorded the album and single Legalise It in 1976 and often smoked huge spliffs on stage. In 1978, before a crowd of 30,000 in Kingston, which included Prime Minister Manley, Mr Tosh puffed a spliff and berated Manley for 30 minutes for refusing to legalise ganja. Tosh had several run-ins with the police and was jailed for possessing marijuana in the mid-1960s. In early 1975, he wrote the anti-police song Mark of the Beast, which was banned from Jamaican radio.
Even in death, Tosh was authentic. Now, whoever said that was right.
So, Jack, your police career took place in a big city in the UK. Did that city have an identifiable Jamaican population?
Yes, there was a significant and settled Jamaican community, and they were very proud of their roots and their heritage. The same as anywhere else, I got on with the vast majority of people. I formed lasting friendships and a lifelong love of reggae music. And just like any community, folk dislike the criminal element intensely. What I did notice was that the Jamaican community was like a big village, so that even in a large city, people tended to be quite insular. I think that's just a state of mind that people brought to Britain between the late 1940s and the 1970s. I don't want to generalise, but lots of them came from villages where everyone knew each other. And when there were disputes, they run deep. Now, as a police officer, I needed to understand different cultures in order to do my job. Let's face it, there have been lots of cases where the police have got it wrong. For me personally, the more I knew about the people in my patch, the less likely I was to make mistakes. Being able to empathise meant I appreciated why some people in the community distrusted the police. It stemmed in part from their experiences in Kingston, Jamaica. Trust is a fragile thing, and I spent my career nurturing it. It was part and parcel of my duty as a police officer.
You mentioned Trench Town, a district of Kingston that was home to migrants from the countryside. They came to find work and then found themselves right at the bottom of the ladder. I imagine the experience of being there shaped people's attitudes towards basically anyone wearing a police uniform anywhere in the world.
Absolutely. Even in the UK, where the police don't routinely carry guns. In my 30 years in the job, I was never required to carry one. If I'd been asked, I'd have done so reluctantly.
Did you visit Jamaica when you were in the job then?
I did. I was there for a few days, and it opened my eyes to how Jamaican people tick. Part of my responsibility was to ensure that a particular Jamaican man was back on Jamaican soil. As we disembarked the plane, he asked me for a favour, to speak up for him if he got a hard time from the police at the immigration desk, because he expected to be interrogated about why he'd been out the country for so long. He passed through the checkpoint without a problem, and I thought that would be the last I would see of him. About 10 minutes later, I was waiting for my hotel taxi, and he appeared again. He was hoping I could give him a lift. He seemed more out of place than I did.
Did you see much of Kingston then?
Yes, a fair bit. It's very much haves and have-nots. The World Bank describes Jamaica as a middle-income country, but its development is being held back by crime and corruption. My hotel was at Port Royal, out in the bay, and originally the main port in the Caribbean, until it was destroyed by an earthquake about 300 years ago. I remember taking a walk and discovering something covered by overgrown vegetation. It was a very old wooden structure made of English oak. It had been a warehouse in the original port. I asked around and I was told that it was the largest prefabricated structure that had ever been transported from England. I asked somewhat naively why this wasn't a tourist attraction. After all, Jamaica gets a quarter of its income from tourism. The answer was quite blunt. The locals feel very much let down and have no enthusiasm to celebrate the slavery and exploitation of the last 400 years. Not only that, the earthquake killed 5,000 people, more than half of whom died from disease in the aftermath. They were not looked after well. The locals also have a view on the criminal reputation of Jamaica. They told me that Port Royal represented nothing good. It may have been the busiest and wealthiest port in the Caribbean, but it was built up on privateers and pirates. At one time, it was described as one of the wickedest places on earth. I learnt my lesson, that ordinary Jamaicans have more pressing things to worry about than the ruins of an old warehouse.
Fascinating. Well, as you say, the island of Jamaica has, for 400 years, been treated as a hedonistic trading port for colonial Europeans. It's grown up with injustice, greed, poverty, violence. And whose fault is that? Certainly not the local populations. Back to that 2001 article in The Guardian. It says, If you wanted someone killed, you would send for a shooter from Kingston. This was such a straightforward and inexpensive option that anything else seemed barely believable. The island may have a reputation for violence, but it is the capital that is almost entirely responsible for the shootings. Most Jamaicans are afraid of Kingston. Even the toughest young guys in the village would talk about Tivoli Gardens or Trench Town in the way Manhattan stockbrokers speak of the Bronx. To them, Kingston was the home of the gunman.
Yes, and there's a video from 1987 that shows a reporter outside Tosh's house on Plymouth Avenue. It is nothing like the living conditions of Trench Town. This is an affluent place on the edge of the urban area. It looks down on Kingston as the land steadily rises towards those blue mountains.
Peter Tosh had made it, hadn't he? He was an international star. He deserved his fame and a more luxurious lifestyle.
He certainly did, but the way Jamaican culture evolved, it's difficult for people to get ahead. Racism is inescapable. The colour of somebody's skin determines where they are on the social scale. Maybe less so today, but 30 years ago, undeniably so. As a dark-skinned black man, Peter Tosh would have been no stranger to inequality, prejudice and struggle. Perhaps that's why, in the Jamaica Broadcasting Corporation documentary about his death, the reporter said that Peter Tosh could not shake off the culture of blood and fire that surrounds reggae music. He had found his fame through a call to revolt and protest about inequality. He was, if anything, authentic.
In fact, the former Prime Minister Michael Manley described Tosh as having had integrity in his anger. Manley served as the fourth Prime Minister of Jamaica from 1972 to 1980, and then from 1989 to 1992. Regarded as a socialist or a populist, Manley had studied economics in London and championed a democratic socialist programme. However, he was in part a product of the old colonial past, his father having been Prime Minister before Jamaican independence in 1962. Throughout Manley's tenure, political violence in Jamaica was commonplace, and when he lost the 1980 election, this unrest reached a new peak. There were 800 deaths recorded across the island nation, and those are the ones we know about. So, Jack, we're trying to understand whether Peter Tosh was shot in a robbery that went wrong or was killed because of a dispute, a jealous falling out between friends who had been once as close as brothers. Let's face it, there were many people willing to kill for a price.
True. All the theories and speculation do not detract from the fact that Lepo Lobban was named by the survivors. He was rightly convicted. Tosh had not sold out from his friends. He'd been trying to run his home in a Rastafarian way, sharing his hospitality. He had in fact allowed Lepo to live with him for some time. He'd actually tried to keep his old friends and maintain his integrity.
Maybe. A lot of these cases involve jealousy and a deep-seated distrust of people with money and influence. Lepo may have been acting for others, or he may have been motivated by rage against injustice and inequality, similar to the subjects of Peter Tosh's crusade. We should also remember that Lepo Lobban has always maintained his innocence.
Maybe so, but what has he got to gain by admitting it now?
That's very true. So, we've looked at the murder of Peter Tosh, where the killer was driven to deliberately kill a successful, high-profile musician. The motive may be somewhat vague, but the deliberate targeting of a celebrity because they've somehow sold out is a strong one. The killer had built up sufficient resentment and anger. He regarded Tosh as a fraud who'd betrayed his followers. Tosh's fall from grace meant that in the eyes of Lepo Lobban at least, he should be eliminated.
Dennis Lepo Lobban was a 33-year-old higgler, a street vendor. He was also a dub poet who recited poetry to reggae music. He had been convicted 8 times, including the illegal possession of firearms and armed robbery. While still a relatively young man, he was going nowhere, stuck in a lifestyle of drugs, music and violence.
Is there any similarity to the man who killed John Lennon? Mark Chapman may have nothing in common with Lepo Lobban. They were from different countries and different cultures, but maybe there was something similar in the motivation. Mark David Chapman was 25 when he killed Lennon. His father was a staff sergeant in the US Air Force. Chapman stated he lived in fear of his father, who was physically abusive towards his mother and unloving towards him. Chapman began to fantasize about having king-like power over a group of imaginary little people who lived in the walls of his bedroom. By the time he was 14, Chapman was using drugs, skipping classes and running away from home. At the age of 16, Chapman became a born-again Presbyterian and began a career with the church supporting children and refugees.
It was during this period that Chapman read J.D. Salinger's controversial novel, The Catcher in the Rye. This book would become of great personal significance to him. He felt a connection with the alienation felt by the main character, Holden. Chapman sympathised with the character. He also wanted to be the catcher in the rye, to be able to stop children from growing up and having to face the angst of becoming an adult.
Chapman's mental health began to suffer. While studying at a Presbyterian art college, he began having suicidal thoughts and feeling like a failure. He dropped out of college and moved to Hawaii, where he attempted suicide. He was then admitted to hospital and diagnosed with clinical depression. In 1978, Chapman went on a 6-week trip round the world. He visited Tokyo, Seoul, Hong Kong, Singapore, Bangkok, Delhi, Beirut, Geneva, Paris, London and Dublin. He began a relationship with his travel agent, a Japanese-American woman named Gloria Abe. He married Gloria in 1979. Chapman then worked as a printer at the hospital where he'd been treated for depression. He was fired by the hospital, rehired, and then quit after an argument with a nurse. He took a job as a night security guard. He began drinking heavily. During this period, he developed a series of obsessions, including artwork, The Catcher in the Rye, and the musician John Lennon. In September 1980, he wrote a letter to a friend, Linda Irish, in which he stated, "I'm going nuts." He signed the letter, "The Catcher in the Rye." Chapman had no criminal convictions prior to his trip to New York to kill Lennon.
Well, you couldn't get a more different profile of the two murderers. Chapman had previously been treated for his mental health and had no previous convictions, whereas Lepo Lobban was a convicted criminal. He may well have had mental health problems and all sorts going off in his life, but in 1980s Kingston, he was unlikely to be diagnosed, let alone treated.
Chapman, on the other hand, had openly developed an obsessive anger towards John Lennon and his celebrity status. This may have been partly based on Lennon's ill-judged comment in 1966 when he said the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. It was clear, though, that Chapman had been unable to cope with adulthood, and maybe he was actually jealous and resentful of Lennon for coping, not only with adulthood, but also fame. Just prior to shooting him, he'd spoken to Lennon and even got his autograph.
And thinking about Lepo, he may not have spent years obsessing about Peter Tosh, but it is clear that in the weeks before the murder, he had become jealous and resentful of Tosh and his lifestyle. Whether the robbery had gone wrong, he had taken something from Tosh and then snuffed him out.
In addition, both Tosh and Lennon were naturally very accessible to others, to their fans. Tosh may have had an open-door lifestyle in comparison to the privacy of Lennon's New York apartment, but Lennon was known to speak with his fans in the street and spend time signing autographs.
Both Tosh and Lennon had remained true to themselves, and both paid the ultimate price.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of the 6 o'clock knock. If you haven't already, you'll find us on Spreaker and wherever you get your podcasts. Please do like, subscribe and all those other fabulous things that help us grow our audience. And if you're able to, please consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your donations help us keep digging and turning over those stones.
We welcome your views too. We're on Twitter at 6knock. How do we do? Is there something you'd like us to look into?
The Governor's right. Your suggestion could become another gripping episode of the 6 o'clock knock.
The 6 o'clock knock is presented by Simon Ford and Jack Morrell and produced by Paul Bradshaw and is available on every major listening app. Please help us spread the word by giving us a 5-star review and telling your friends to subscribe.